Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Foreign election interference. It's back in the news in a big way. This week, both Pierre Poilievre and Mark Carney faced questions about foreign meddling in Canadian democracy. Poilievre still dogged by his refusal to get security clearance. Carney pressed to explain why the Liberals ousted an MP with ties to the Indian government. Are Canada's democratic institutions prepared to take on the threat of foreign interference in this federal election? I'm David Smith. Today on The Big Story, we're digging back into foreign election interference and why it's back making headlines after week one of the 2025 campaign. Today I'm speaking with Michael Kempa, a criminology professor at the University of Ottawa with a special interest in the politics of national security. Hi, Michael. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, David.
It's great to have you here. I know you're a keen observer of this file specifically. So this week, it started with a story from the Globe and Mail, as published on Tuesday. The Globe quotes a source with knowledge of attempted interference by the government of India in the 2022 Conservative leadership race. That was the Conservative leadership race that Pierre Poilievre won handily in a record landslide victory. So what do you make of the details in the Globe and Mail story? From my reading, it's not exactly a bombshell filled with new information. It's information that was previously released through the Hogue Commission and an earlier report from the CBC as well. It's coming from a different source this time, someone with top secret clearance who's leaked it to the Globe. What was your reaction to those revelations about the Conservative leadership race? Anything surprising for you?
The only thing I found surprising was just the little bit of detail specifically about the leadership race for Pierre Poilievre himself with the CPC contest a couple of years ago, and the timing. As you say, we already knew, we'd been told that there had been foreign interference in multiple electoral and leadership contests in the past in the Hogue Commission. It involved all the political parties, so it has affected everybody at some time or another. All that we've learned now is it's specifically to do with, in this case, Poilievre's contest a couple of years ago. That's surprising. We didn't know that before. And the specific timing of this leak from somebody in CSIS at the inception of an election campaign, that in itself is surprising. Why now?
Why now? Yeah, exactly. So following that story, Pierre Poilievre was facing many questions again about his security clearance. So there was this original report from a parliamentary committee studying foreign election interference that was offered as a briefing to the federal party leaders if they obtained security clearance. Pierre Poilievre refused. He doesn't want the clearance. He says that's because if he gets his security clearance and he reads this report, which would have more detail than what has been reported in the media, he will not be able to speak about it publicly. And he says that amounts to silencing him on the issue. This week, in defense of that decision not to get his clearance, he said he shouldn't have to get clearance because he was a cabinet minister a decade ago in the Stephen Harper government. And there seems to be some debate about whether Poilievre can be briefed on what CSIS knows about the 2022 Conservative leadership race. Based on your understanding, does Poilievre's previous security clearance still stand, or does it need to be renewed?
So all around, I'm going to hand out lumps where they're deserved from in a nonpartisan way for everybody in this process. So Mr. Poilievre's arguments that he doesn't need an update on security clearance, that simply doesn't wash. He's been told by CSIS and other members in the security network, including the CSE, which is a little bit of our online security agency, that he needs this update to receive essential information. So yeah, he does need to update it on the argument that, well, if I have this clearance and I have the information, I'm then not able to say anything about it. All right. Well, then if you don't have information, what of use would you have to say on the subject other than what's at the top of your own mind? You know, in other words, if there's a story circulating about foreign interference and you don't have any information, you're then free as a politician to circulate whatever your particular opinions or theories about what's going on may be. What's the public value of that? If you have security clearance and you have the details, no, you can't release all the details to the public, but then you can then intervene in your public discussion in a responsible way. So, to my mind, there's really no good excuse at this point for Mr. Poilievre not going forward and getting his security clearance. I do understand that he's been so adamant on the point for so long that now it would look like a little bit of a reversal. Politically speaking, he might not want to make that reversal in the middle of a campaign, just sort of quietly do it later once he's sworn in as prime minister.
Right, right. So if we can keep kind of pulling at that thread, another question that I have heard a lot this week as people are reading these stories again and reminding themselves what this situation is with Poilievre's security clearance is what happens if he becomes the prime minister? If he wins the election and he becomes the prime minister, would he still refuse to get security clearance? Would he have no choice in the matter at that point? Or would it be a case of, would the political argument be moot because he's already won the election? What do you think about that?
So there's been kind of confusing discussions around that. Mr. Poilievre himself said, if I'm prime minister, they have no choice but to give me the information. That is, in a sense, true, but it would be very reassuring to everybody involved, including Canadian citizens, if the prime minister had received his due process security clearance to receive that information. In other words, he'll get the information as prime minister one way or another, but it would just look a lot better for Canadians if the prime minister submitted to that very ordinary process.
Okay, that makes sense. So I want to shift gears and look at the Liberal side of this story, because both of these leaders face questions about foreign interference this week. At a campaign event earlier this week, Liberal leader Mark Carney questioned the integrity of the 2022 Conservative leadership race. This is where the politics start to mix with the very serious issue of national security. So I think it's important to talk about this. It's a key piece of this whole foreign interference file that may have been muddled a bit by the politicking around it. There is evidence of meddling in elections and the Conservative leadership race, yes. But according to the findings of the Ogue Commission, the public inquiry on interference, as well as other reports leaked to the media, so far, as I understand it, no security agency has found any evidence that the interference attempts were actually successful. There was interference, or attempted interference, but it didn't change the outcome. So based on the details that have been reported, do you think there's enough evidence to suggest that the leadership race results with respect to Mr. Poilievre are illegitimate?
No, and so when I mentioned handing out fair lumps to everybody in a nonpartisan way, I don't think it's responsible for Liberal leader Mark Carney to say that, there's doubt on the integrity of the 2022 CPC leadership race. I mean, Mr. Poilievre won in a landslide, more than 80% of the vote and so forth. There's just no indication whatsoever that outcome was in any way swayed by foreign interference. Now, integrity is it is one of those sort of weasel words that it can be taken to mean a lot of things. Integrity means, was the vote fully free and fair? Well, no, it wasn't, because there was some foreign interference. But if you question integrity, it also sounds like you're suggesting that maybe just perhaps the outcome was swayed one way or another. That's where I have that problem with the use of that word. Mark Carney really, it's an argument that he can win very easily without going to hyperbole. He can just say, look, it's come out in the Ogue Commission. This problem pervades all of the political parties. All of the other party leadership has their security clearance so that they get the information that they need to properly address this issue within their parties. We're doing it, for example, he may say, in the Liberal Party, and Mr. Poilievre should do the same. He doesn't have to go so far as to say or sort of suggest, well, maybe just perhaps the leadership contest was swayed in one direction by foreign interest. The integrity is questionable. That's a little bit silly.
Okay. This next question is a bit convoluted, so just bear with me here, but I think it's worth examining this angle because it speaks to the systems we have in place in Canada to combat foreign election interference in our politics. Liberal leader Mark Carney was asked this week by the Globe and Mail, the outlet that broke the news story this week, about the disqualification of somebody named Chandra Arya from the Liberal leadership race. Chandra Arya was a backbench Liberal MP since 2015. He'd been an outspoken critic of the Khalistan movement, that's a flashpoint in Indian politics. Last summer, while sitting as an MP, Chandra Arya traveled to India, and he actually met in person with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Now, this was after the very serious allegations that the Indian government had been involved in an assassination on Canadian soil of a Sikh activist. The Liberal Party then disqualified Chandra Arya from not only just the Liberal leadership race that they just held, but then he was subsequently banned from running again for the Liberal Party altogether. It's now been revealed by subsequent reporting from the Globe and Mail that the Liberal Party made that decision because of evidence of foreign interference. There were concerns raised by CSIS due to Chandra Arya's ties to the Indian government. When Mark Carney was asked this week whether the Liberals have any evidence themselves of foreign interference by India with respect to Chandra Arya's candidacy, Carney said it was the Liberal Party's decision to disqualify him. Not his decision, Carney is the leader, but the party's decision, and he has not been briefed on it. He hasn't been read into it. What I want to know is this. If the Liberal Party did have evidence that Chandra Arya was somehow a witting or unwitting target of foreign interference, would they have to disclose that, or is it within their rights to simply disqualify him and never explain why?
So first step, I would say, yes, every political party has, what they call a green light committee, which is a number of party operatives, the civilians that work for a party, including some who are members of parliament, that vet everybody who runs for the party. They make the kind of ground level call on material intelligence that they might receive from CSIS. And I would say I'd like to see that go to the prime minister, because in the end, it is, or any party leader for that matter, it's the party leader who's responsible for signing off on each and every candidate. Although that committee may make the decision, ultimately they should brief the leader, in this case, the prime minister, Mark Carney, who would be fully aware of why somebody's being disqualified and have the ultimate say on the matter as party leader before that decision is finally taken. I do think that there's a responsibility to inform the public. There's also a self-interest for any political party, because if you Bigfoot somebody out of a riding, in other words, you've got a confirmed candidate that's won a nomination and they're being pushed out in favor of a bigger name, in this case, obviously, Mark Carney himself, you probably want to explain to people what that's all about so that local associations and locally engaged people don't feel that their work is being turned aside or not appreciated and so forth. You don't have to go into detail. You could simply say, we've received concerning information about this candidate that they could be compromised and they've been disqualified.
Right. If we think about that and place it in the broader context of how Canada's institutions respond to foreign interference, political parties are private organizations. They are not subject to the Canada Elections Act. There's no piece of legislation that really governs them. So if we think about this situation where we have one party leader in Pierre Poilievre who has not gotten his security clearance and does not apparently have the details of whatever happened in 2022, even though CSIS would be willing to share them with him if he got his security clearance. We have, on the other hand, the Liberal Party leader, Mark Carney, whose party made a decision to disqualify a candidate based on allegations, or evidence rather, of foreign interference, but they're not going to tell him the details of it, and he apparently doesn't want to know. And they're perfectly within their rights to do that because they are private political parties. Is that problematic?
It is. This was one of the major messages of the OG Commission, which is all political parties have been very, very reluctant to modify their rules, particularly the Liberal Party, to be fair, to tighten things up against foreign interference. It's sort of a plus minus here. If you're a political party, you need as much information and as much engagement from the public as you possibly can in the lead up to elections, signing people up as supporting members, getting their addresses, email addresses, so you can communicate with them, solicit donations, get the vote out on the day in question when the election is finally in play. And the more you restrict a party's rules, the fewer people end up in your databases. So they've all been very reluctant. But Ogue has said, look, when you're running nominations, when you're deciding on who the final candidates should be, this is not as simple as you doing a little private sort of club activity. It has massive public consequences. And these processes should be governed by the same laws that apply to elections. In other words, Elections Canada should get involved in overseeing these types of nominations processes and making sure that the rules are being followed. So it is a big deal. Parties like to do things privately because they run their nominations in the ways that suit their electoral objectives. But it's just of such public consequence that really you have to put some baseline of Elections Canada enforceable rules so that any meddling around with nominations or not sharing information or willful blindness on the part of party leadership actually becomes a criminal offense rather than just a violation of their own rules.
And is that something that Justice Ogue had recommended formally after the interference inquiry?
Yes, and to my mind, that's amongst her most important recommendations, which is basically, think about this. When we go back to the example everybody's very familiar with is with Mr. An Dong in the Don Valley North riding of Toronto. So we had all reports through the Ogue Commission. It all became public. CSIS had warned the Prime Minister that there were some concerns, that there were these busloads of Chinese national students in Canada on visas that were being strong-armed to show up and vote for Mr. Dong in his nomination contest, unbeknownst perhaps to Mr. Dong, but nevertheless, he was the unwitting beneficiary. What are we going to do about that? Well, the fact that that's happening is a problem. It's not good. It's not in keeping with the spirit of the Liberal Party's nomination rules. But the fact of the matter is, nobody's breaking any actual laws there. It's not governed. If you did that with an actual election, started bringing in people who are not qualified to actually vote on buses to support a candidate, that's a criminal offense. So if I was a fly on the wall at that meeting with the Prime Minister at the time, Justin Trudeau, and CSIS is laying that intelligence on him, he would have said, is this a criminal violation? No, it's a violation of your own rules. Okay, well then we probably don't want to bring this out publicly in the middle of an election campaign. We'll just deal with it internally. So we have these concerns about this particular MP. We can keep an eye on it. Maybe we cannot appoint this person to particular key parliamentary roles until we're satisfied, perhaps, that these concerns have been dealt with. If it's a criminal matter, party leadership just can't deal with it that way. They'd say, well, we've got this intelligence. We must take action. We are now criminally liable. That's where Justice Ogue wanted to go.
And the problem, right, Michael, is these political parties have to put up their hand and volunteer to become regulated and governed. And how likely are they to do that?
Very unlikely, because as I say, if you have lax rules, it simply enables you to extend your hand deeper into the community to gather more information, more addresses, more email addresses from people in the community that you can identify as supporters. There's nothing nefarious about this. This is how elections work. You got to identify your supporters to get the vote out on an election day. And the laxer your rules are, well, the more you can find out about people in your community and have that database in place to get the vote out on the day in question. But then, of course, there's that payoff. If your rules are too lax, well, that's no good in the public interest. They're corruptible by foreign states and other actors, non-state actors, potentially even terror organizations that have an interest in upsetting the stability of our democracy.
So broadly speaking, we have a few weeks now to go in this campaign. April 28th, Canadians will head to the polls. Based on what we know now after the inquiry and the Ogue report, how much of a factor will foreign interference play in this election?
Well, I mean, we've been forewarned by not just the Ogue Commission, but NSICOP, the National Security Special Parliamentary Committee, that foreign interference is a reality. I mean, by now, Canadians are pretty alive to the idea every political party has been infiltrated at one point or another by foreign actors. There are all manner of people and states with bad intentions that circulate mis and disinformation in social media with the view to fanning up divisions in our society and undermining faith in our democracy. I mean, by now, this is almost a foregone conclusion. Political parties need to almost sort of level with Canadians, accept that Canadians are intelligent and say, look, we all know that this is a problem. We're dealing with it. And I actually think voters would reward political parties that take initiative on addressing news that may leak about problems of foreign interference in their party, rather than just sort of say, well, we either didn't know about it or this is something that didn't affect outcomes. Nothing to see here.
So we talked a lot about political parties, but there is a role for the actual government to play here. So maybe we can close on this today. Looking forward, after the election, there will be a new government of Canada. What changes should the incoming federal government consider to bolster defense against foreign interference in Canadian democracy? For example, one tool that the US and the UK have that Canada has not implemented, though it has been recommended many times, though the previous Liberal government had said for many years that they were going to implement it. It's called a foreign agent registry. Would something like that be a positive action we could look for from the incoming new Canadian government?
Well, it's definitely helpful. We got about halfway there with some hearings through Parliament and the Senate this past summer on that issue. Registries are helpful. Obviously, the bad actors don't register themselves, obviously. But the responsible actors who know some of these disreputable actors do register. We watch the activity of the reputable foreign actors in Canada, and where we see that there may be adjacent agencies active, we can sort of reach out to those knowledgeable actors who have registered, and they can provide information. In other words, it's nothing other than a tool to illuminate some of the top level, most transparent nodes in networks of foreign actors who work in Canada. And those networks have information about who below them, who are not registered, are problematic. So we need to do that. We need to change the law around regulating political parties' activities in the lead up to elections, most especially nominations, and have Elections Canada oversee those nominations. And really, I'm not a big fan of regulating speech in cyberspace and so forth. It's more about public education. People need to, and young people in particular, need that awareness to discern between reputable sources of information in cyberspace from that which is simply nonsense and manipulative.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that and expand on it just a little bit. When you think about, maybe I'm being too general, but when I think about foreign election interference, I conjure this mental image of very clandestine, old school spy stuff, very envelopes being passed back and forth in darkened parking garages and things. But it's often much simpler than that. How big of a role does social media play when we talk about foreign interference writ large?
Absolutely massive in social media. We're all familiar with the concept of benefactors, people that donate money to socially progressive causes around the world, whether we're talking about potable water or vaccinations or family planning, contraceptive issues around the planet, people who put their money behind that. There's another class of donor which we can think of as being, rather than benefactors, they're misanthropic donors. There are groups around the planet, for example, fundamentalist Christian groups in the United States, that put money behind circulating corrosive messages in social media, put money behind corrosive candidates in the political process, not at the federal level, more at the sort of school trustee, municipal councillor level. They're putting money behind circulating these messages. Don't be naive, of course. Social media messaging is a very profitable business, and there are people who are putting money behind these messages. It's a big industry.
Okay, great advice for the listeners. Thank you so much for your time today, Michael Kempa, for helping us to make sense of these headlines and this very serious issue, which is now a feature of our democracy and will continue to be throughout the 21st century and beyond. It's been great speaking with you and having you on The Big Story today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And like the Australians say, be alert, but not alarmed.
And again, that was Michael Kempa, University of Ottawa criminology professor with a special interest in the politics of security and public safety. And that is The Big Story for today. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode. Email us hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or send us a voicemail at 416-935-5935. We love hearing from you. You can find us on the Seeker app or any of your other favorite podcast players. We're everywhere. Please remember to rate, review, follow, and share. Until next time, I'm David Smith. Thank you for listening.